Thanks everybody for coming. Today's episode of supply chain consulting, we're going to talk a little bit about supply chain design, network design, and last mile. Tonight I'm going to put on a concert, so you can come back and we'll do some music and hip hop. So I work for Invista when I'm not being a comedian, a poorly paid comedian, and Invista is a consulting firm. We basically do end-to-end supply chain consulting and strategy, all the systems, and we install automation and do integration with systems. And there's a reason why we kind of do all those things. The interesting thing about supply chain, my insight, is that supply chain is not something you can just do top-down strategically. You kind of have to get in the weeds. Like the devil's in the details, and you have to get in the weeds. I've been doing this with Invista for 10 years. I've got about 30 years experience. I went to too many Ivy League schools, some in Boston, some in California. I have a little bit of insight into this. I've done about 400 network designs and supply chain designs with companies you know. And so I kind of learned things, right, around this. And some of the things I learned is one is that it's a lot harder than it looks. If you work in supply chain, it's harder than it looks, and anything could break at any point in time. I mean, I was in the Army too, right? I mean, we always had Murphy's Law, right? Which is if it can break or go wrong, it will break or go wrong. And so when you think about designing a supply chain, you're trying to design in reliability, you're trying to design in cost, you're trying to design in service levels, and you really kind of have to think about the experience that you want to have. And that's what I want to talk a little about today is kind of how you build that experience, how you want to make that work. And you have to design it. It doesn't just happen. It has to be extremely intentional. And there's a lot of words here, but basically, I want to just kind of talk about network optimization, how you kind of design that, how you create that type of experience. And talk a little bit about the strategies, give you some examples. And again, I've got too many years experience with this, so if you all have questions, you should ask me these questions. And if you're not asking me questions, it means you're not paying attention, and there will be a test. Okay, so one of the things to kind of keep in mind is you're really trying to understand what the customer experience you want to have. What experience do you want to have? So let's say I'm a retail company and I sell aftermarket automotive parts. And who am I selling to? Well, I'm selling to the garage mechanic, right? People like me, bad mechanics who use YouTube. That's me. And so bad mechanics who use YouTube really don't know what they need. They know which part they're trying to replace. They don't know the other 4 parts they need. So, and if cars broke down in my garage, that means I can't park my other stuff in there. So time is of the essence, right? Everybody wants stuff quick, and they may not know exactly what they need. So how do I create an experience so I can have all those parts available and tell you when you're going to get these parts and when that's going to, where I can get them, right? Either ship to my house, pick up in the store, whatever that looks like. And so when I design from that customer experience, work my way backwards, well, there's a lot involved in the chain. So some of these companies sell, just use an example with automotive parts, they may sell 250, 300,000 SKUs, right? Their stores carry about 15,000. So if I go to the store, right, I got a small probability, some probability that the product's there, but again, the probability drops off fast as I go down that long tail of items. So how do I cost effectively put all those items up there so the shade tree mechanic, they call them, can get access to those parts, usually like them same day, next day? How do I do that? So based on the customer experience I'm trying to design, I have an entire supply chain backing up that store based of different type of distributors. Maybe it's hub stores, maybe it's import centers, maybe consolidation centers overseas. I have all this design behind it, and it has to be all connected, right, to kind of make that experience come alive. It's a very complicated piece to do. But here's what I've learned. If you start with the customer experience and work your way backwards and intentionally design that entire supply chain, it's a lot easier. What I find most of the time is companies are sort of ad hoc trying to create the customer experience, or maybe they didn't design the experience up front. They're just trying to get you the product as quick as they can, right? It's very expensive, by the way. Right? It's very expensive to do what it takes to make a customer happy. You have to intentionally design the experience and know when you're going to say no. So what we find is that certainly, honestly, if it's a manufacturer or retail company, we find that a lot of similarities apply here. It's not just on the retail side, but if you take a look at how you work your way upstream, what you determine is you need multiple layers in your supply chain. And the reason is because, demand is not steady. Demand's always going up, down. You got seasonality. Anybody ever seen those pop-up tents, spirit tents? They sell Halloween costumes. That's my client. When you talk about seasonality, you have no idea, right? They only have stores 6 weeks out of the year, and they run year round. So, yeah, they have seasonality, but it has to be intentionally designed to kind of support that ebb and flow. And it's very expensive to build the church for Easter Sunday, so you have to kind of think about how much fixed and variable capacity I want to build into this. But the other thing that's very important is to kind of understand all the way back to the source, where am I going to source from? How is that going to flow and move through that, right? And so that's kind of how I want you to think about designing a supply chain is start with that customer experience and work your way all the way back to the source. Because what we find is you find a lot of silos in companies. The store operations wants one thing, the DC operations want something else. The people who are doing the planning and buying, they want something different as well. And those silos aren't aligned. If you start with the customer experience design, work your way back, then that gets everybody aligned. Here's another thing that that we run into quite a bit is, our business is split 50-50 between retail and manufacturing and some wholesale. So on the storefront, I used to run a retail chain before I came to Invista. And I can tell you, there's a lot of cost in stores, lots of labor, right? I mean, you think the warehouse has a lot of labor. Stores got a lot more labor involved. And so, in today's supply chains, stores are also nodes, okay? They're also supply chain nodes. And so how do I make a store, if I'm shipped from the store and managing it as a node, how do I design that? So one of the things that we do, so we take a look at supply chain, we will design the retail labor model, and how do I put product there? How do I ship product out? How do I make sure that the last mile design here, either to the store or shipped from the store, is effective? So let's use the auto parts example. So I'm a shade tree mechanic. I'm like, hey, I want this product. I can't go to the store, so ship a product from a store to my house so I can finish my car. They ship that product out. Now, that store's now out of stock. That's the last one they had. So are they going to replenish that one item that they shipped out from the DC? I mean, if they do, guess what? They lost money on that, right? It's an easy way to lose money, is to ship from the store and then replenish the store that same item, because I touched it too many times, right? So then there's a question, where do I want to ship it from? I mean, stores are very inefficient warehouses, extremely inefficient, right? So if I have an e-com business and I have a situation like that where I got to ship a one-off, just think I have a lot of manual touches to replenish to that store as opposed to shipping it direct out of a more automated e-commerce facility, okay? However, even in those situations, if you take a look at how the store inventory operates, that's an interesting back of the store there. That's pretty typical. If you take a look at the way that stores are mapped and laid out, they're not really laid out very well for the picking. I mean, if everybody goes to Walmart or Kroger and there are people in the aisle, right, trying to pick those individual orders, we'll see how long that lasts. It's very expensive also. Trying to pick manually costs about 3 to 4 times as much as it does in a more automated warehouse. Again, an easy way to lose money, right? So just think about, if I have a poor store layout, I manually pick an item, ship it out to my customer, and then replenish that item back to that store, I probably didn't even pay for the cost of the goods, at that point. I'm completely upside down. So, in grocery, which is already a low margin business, they kind of have this figured out a little bit. So inside of a store operations, when you kind of take a look at it, they have certain customer segments. Remember we said design from the customer backward? They have certain customer segments that are very high value for them. So what they do is they say within this segment, here's what they want to buy. And here's what they want to buy in the store, and here's the stuff that they want to have shipped to their house or brought out to their car. And so they will target only those customers because they're high value and they don't want to lose them, and they will design ship from store or pick and brought out to your car specifically for that segment, right? And they know which customers they lose money on doing that and know which customers they make money doing that on. And it's about the entire customer profitability. So that's kind of how most of it works on the retail operations. Otherwise, it's hard to make money with it. But the other thing to kind of consider is, and as part of the last mile, is how do I design my supply chain to make it easy for the store, to put stuff from the back of the store to the shelf. So it's another thing that you're going to obviously take a look at when you design a supply chain. You have to design a supply chain with the store operations in mind. So network optimization is kind of fun. This is kind of the nerdy part of supply chain, super nerd part, which I am a super nerd when I'm not singing. So if you take a look at it, you can design different types of operations based on different types of modes that you want to have. And what you would take a look at is based on how many distribution centers and the proximity of them, what is my mix of transportation, my relative costs associated with that, and service level trade-off, okay? Now, it's a cool, nerdy thing to do is to figure out, do I want 1 DC, 2 DCs? Do I want a hub and spoke model? Do I want, how am I going to get, always the fun question, how do I get stuff into Canada? And kind of map all that out. And so when we do these designs, you have to think about it that inside of all these supply chains have a very complicated curve. It's a trade-off between cost and service, inventory, cycle time. All of your supply chains have that. And what's important is to understand the shape of that curve. All of this modeling is based on an point in time. And things will change over time, right? So there is some obsolescence to any model that you do, right? And so one of the things you want to understand is the shape of the curve. If I add DCs, what happens, right? There's a trade-off. And so what are those trade-offs and how do I get that? So when conditions change, you understand the shape of that curve and how it works. In this particular client, right, we're trying to determine, how many distribution centers and the trade-off between shipping from DCs and stores or combinations of DCs and stores. And this is a very simple model, right? Most models are far more complicated. And if you think about it, when I ship from the DC, there's actually a trade-off between how much automation's in the DC. If it's a more automated DC, that variable cost goes down. I may ship more from the distribution center, obviously, as opposed to shipping from the store. Then you got to calculate in the replenishment. If I ship from the store and I got to replenish that item back in the store, and it's hard to make money in that scenario. So I might ship more from the e-com for the significant portion of the inventory. And understanding all that trade-off is the complicated, nerdy part, all right? Here's the other thing you got to do. You would have to execute this as well, right? So when you design a supply chain, you always have to think, okay, but how am I going to run this thing? And we've done lots of designs that our clients said, that's really cool, but we ain't doing that. And not just because it costs a lot of money and capital and infrastructure, but also because they have system limitations and things like that. The store operations people would have to execute it, which is always a significant challenge. So you're going to take a look at all these trade-offs, and based on the trade-offs, understand the shape, again, kind of the shape of the curve. What do the trade-offs look like? How much more am I going to spend to get a better service level or lower inventory? Then you got to think about, okay, this is a point in time or maybe an average across a year. What happens during, peak seasons? What happens during the off season, right? What happens during COVID? We didn't model a lot of COVID scenarios in 2019 or 2018. But we did have at least one client, actually looks a lot like this, and we modeled a ship from store scenario for them and what that trade-off would look like. And miraculously, they used that in 2020 and 2021 and kept them in business. That's because they could keep their stores productive and shipping out with a high service level. That really kind of kept their business alive. So there's always going to be these trade-offs that you're going to design in, but you also want to have flexibility, because what will happen is these snapshots in time would change throughout the seasonality of the year, the back to school or Christmas or whatever it is. You may have to shift that. So you kind of have to take a look at how the year flows. Almost all retail has some seasonality in it. So as that year flows, these will change, right? The kind of the results. And then as you grow over time, it would change again. So when you do these designs, we normally, always say design from the customer backward, design from the future to the present. And you want to kind of take a look at not just the point in time, but what happens with my seasonality and how would that experience change if I do different options. So I love time. I'm always in a hurry, and I drive motorcycles very fast, so I'm in a hurry. And it's interesting that time is always something that's stuck in my head. And time in companies is money, but time is not something you measure. How many KPIs do you really have that measures the entire end-to-end cycle time? Very few companies I know have anything like that. But time is actually money. The longer period of time from the point of demand to the time you order creates more forecasting accuracy, creates inventory build. There's a lot of issues with time, not just on the outbound shipping to your customers, but also on the inbound from the suppliers. So it's one of the things you always kind of think about is how do I compress time? Every time you compress time out of the supply chain, everything gets easier because you're not guessing as much, right? And if I can get stuff to customers faster, it's a competitive advantage, obviously. So when you kind of take a look at your network design, this is more focused on the outbound side, but you do the same model on the inbound side and say, hey, look, based on these different options and scenarios, how much time am I compressing? Now, part of that time in the order cycle time has to be built around the store operations and the DC operations, and if I'm shipping from a vendor, what happens from that. So always kind of take a look at what that time compression looks like. It's got to be a dimension you would always want to dig into is what is my time compression, how much can I build in there, and what does it cost me to do it? But we do find that time compression creates a lot of synergies inside of companies. It just makes it easier to make decisions, right? I'm not guessing about when things are going to happen in the future or when the vendors are shipping. So there are a couple things to think about from a last mile perspective. One of them obviously is on the transportation view of things. If I have trucks or I use third-party trucks or how I'm designing that out, a lot of times inside of a supply chain design, there's kind of the details, right, in the weeds. And some of that's routing, like where are the trucks going and where are they delivering? And are they picking up, supplies on the way back? And so it's one of the things we always kind of take a look at is, okay, what is my trade-off and the different types of routing and deliveries that I might have? So obviously some of my clients, they've got fleets of trucks and some of them are just using third parties. But at the end of the day, the devil's in the details of how you model how this is going to operate. So the complication in trying to design the routing is obviously, the Monday routes are probably different than Tuesday routes, different than Wednesday routes. How much modeling are we going to do around the routing? But we always find that there's some trade-off that you're going to have around the different routing. So in this case, we're kind of taking a look at a model where we're trying to figure out how frequently should we replenish to the stores and what's the relative cost trade-off. Frequency of replenishment drives my service level, my in-stocks, back to my customer experience, right? So I start with my customer experience. Okay, well, how often do I have to do this replenishment? Depends on the volume of the store, obviously. Depends on how close it is to the DC, all those things. And when you design this part of the last mile of the supply chain, you'll integrate this this model to get you a better answer. So we normally find that most companies, even that have fleets, run relatively static, and that their If they have trucks, their empty miles means, the number of miles where they hadn't picked up a vendor pickup on the way back or not taking returns, all that stuff is usually pretty high. Most of the time, it's not even measured very well. So if you either have a third party or your own trucks, you make sure that you got a pretty accurate scorecard related to that, because you need that for your design. What we normally find is a lot of the routing that my clients do is reactive, right? You design a supply chain and then try to figure out what happens after that. Like, you need to design it in and help you understand what should the fleet look like, and also how am I going to do my routing, and how often am I going to make changes to it. Routing is something that's also changes quite a bit seasonally, and you can design that in your supply chain as, okay, now it's Halloween or now it's Christmas or whatever it is, and there's a date where, okay, we're going to do reroutes. And as long as you can do reroutes, as long as everybody kind of knows, and it's more, if I change 4 times a year and they know, okay, here's the reroute time, usually customers don't care that much. It's the randomness that stores and customers don't like as much. Okay. All right. One of my favorite topics, inventory. I love inventory. I find inventory to be fascinating because I did turnarounds in companies. I would always dig in. I would always say, give me your inventory data. I want to see your snapshots. I want to take a look at your SKU profiles. Because I find that inventory is the repository of all the bad decisions that happen in a company. If I want to know what happened in sales or marketing or logistics or whatever, it's sitting somewhere in the warehouse. Or it was written off, right? Even worse. And you kind of understand. You got to have to take a look at inventory as the pros and the cons. You got to have the inventory. You got to sell the inventory. But you also have to kind of understand, where do I make money in a company? And what's fascinating in almost every company is you only make money in so many SKUs, right? It's the 80-20 rule. It's probably 20%, 30% of your SKUs are probably all the profit in your business. I had one client, they were running out of space in a DC, and they're like, hey, we need to build another DC. I'm like, great, what do you want to put in it? Well, we got a lot of slow movers. I was like, that's great. Let's run some math. And we found out that those slow movers generated 500,000, this is a big company, generated 500,000 of gross margin a year. It's a $50 million building for 500,000 a year. Who's doing that? Anybody take that investment? Because I'll give you investment advice. So we didn't do that, right? It's like, you got to find out how to make more money on your items to get your positioning right. So one of the things that's important is to understand, people who run supply chain, they want to SKU rationalize. You can't just SKU rationalize. I mean, that's a lot of times that assortment is how you get customers in. I used to run a company called Dean & DeLuca. People would walk into our stores all the time to buy olive oil. I had about 80 olive oils on the shelf. And the reason I had 80 olive oils, only sold 5 of them consistently. I had 80 because that's how people walked in the door, right? Because I had 80 olive oils. I can't just get rid of them. But you got to figure out how to optimize that in your supply chain. And you kind of take a look at this. This is a very representative client here on the right-hand side. Look, I mean, they got a lot of SKUs in here, but there's a bunch of them over here. I'm never going to make money on these SKUs, and they're dragging my entire fill rate service level down. That's what happens, right? I mean, you could be in a situation where your long tail is killing your service level. You're getting chargebacks, making customers upset. Like, it could be lose, lose, lose on those. So you got to think about what I'm going to do with them. Where am I going to position them? How I'm going to set them? Do I want to hold them back and centralize them? Or how am I going to work with that? So that's a key part of the design of a supply chain, is designing where's my inventory going to go. It's not an afterthought. What we run into most frequently is sort of what people call the Amazon effect. Most companies either manufacture or sell 5 times as many SKUs as they did maybe 20 years ago. It doesn't matter who it is. I mean, engine manufacturers make a lot more different types of engines. There's kind of a proliferation of SKUs that are happening. If you have a proliferation of SKUs and you're trying to have high service levels at a similar or better cost, you have to design echelons. It doesn't really matter if you're a manufacturer or a retail business or somebody in between. You design echelons. You can't keep every SKU all the way up where the customer is. You have to figure out, based on my echelons, where do I want to put stuff? And, on the retail side, we work with a lot of companies to design, what the hub store concepts and store-to-store replenishment, things like that, to kind of help quite a bit. And then inside your distribution centers, maybe you need, if you have a lot of imports that are that are seasonal, that you normally are. Maybe I need an import center. Maybe I need larger DCs feeding smaller replenishment DCs. But those echelons are an important piece of that. If I'm a manufacturer, I may have, if I have some slow movers, I may want to centralize where those are and hang on to those till I know where my demand is. It's an important thing to kind of think through, because let's take a look at the stores, right? Stores have some demand, and I have clients that they'll push every SKU forward. Every item gets pushed all the way to the store. But those stores don't sell consistently seasonally, right? And those demand patterns change. What I normally find, having run retail, is that in the beginning of the season, you have relatively consistent demand compared to what you did last year. But near the end of the season, you don't really know where it's going to sell, because the weather will change or things happen, right? And so a lot of times what we'll do is you can wave in product so that you have a certain amount you push forward, and then hold back some of it so you kind of know where it's going to go, right? And then feed it in later as you get later into the season. So I like the environment. I like to make sure the environment's better than it was. And the worst thing for the environment is to have something manufactured on the other side of the world, brought all the way over to the United States. We put it into a distribution center, then we ship it to a store, and then we either don't sell it and mark it down and send it to TJ Maxx, where I do a lot of shopping, or they get it and then it gets returned and it just kind of sits there and we end up putting in a landfill, right? Because we spent a lot of emissions and carbon and money, right, only to throw it away. So the reason I bring that up is when you design these echelons, when you aggregate that demand upstream, you can control where that inventory goes and kind of protect yourself a little bit, so you don't have as many returns, you don't have as many write-downs, markdowns, stuff going to TJ Maxx. And that's kind of a big trick, is figuring out how to do these echelons. It's part of almost every design we do. So again, in supply chain, details are everything. And some of these details include, hey, look, where do we want to put another node or warehouse or maybe a hub store, right? And so you got a lot of new factors that are challenges. Obviously, real estate can be very expensive or not very expensive, depending on where you're at. Getting people to work in a warehouse is becoming more challenging over time. Also, kind of understanding, if I'm shipping out from a particular location that's congested, like LA or New England, proximity and the roads networks are something you kind of have to take a look at. So we'll do very detailed site analytics. We have access to all the way down to cell phone data and others to kind of take a look at, what does the labor force look like? Where are the people coming from that would be working? If we send trucks out to do delivery, what roads would they take? What kind of congestion do we have on those roads? And kind of work through it. So again, that's a drill down, a level of detail, but you can't really make a good decision until you do this, right? And understand what my trade-offs look like from a supply chain design perspective. It sounds a little creepy to get people's cell phone data that's aggregated, not individual, but it's out there, just so you know. I may or may not have your cell phone data. All right, so we talked a little about cycle time. Again, it's kind of one of those things I find in every operation, whether it's store operations, replenishment operations, warehouse operations, from the time you make a buy until the time the product shows up, that time costs a lot of money. And I have hundreds of examples of where we came through some cycle time compression, and it helped the company, much more than they ever would have considered. We had one client that, they were manufacturing product, and to save money, they got some internationally sourced components to go into their engines. They were making engines, and so they're like, okay, we're going to go over and we'll place orders, but the lead time was 10, 12 months, right? By the time I placed the order, I did the forecast, and I bring the product in, and of course, they want to be lean, so they're like, we're going to just in time this inventory. So just as the factory needs this product, we'll bring it in there. What do you think their forecast accuracy was 10 months out? It was like 30%. It was terrible. They had no idea what they're going to make 10 months out. So what did they do? they air freighted 80% of it, right? All that lean stuff is gone. Lean works really well, just so you know. Toyota production system, when the factory's right next to your factory and you can get it there. If it's on the other side of the world, it doesn't work that well. So what we determined was, hey, look, there's a buffer you have to put in here to some level of inventory and trade-off to kind of help that, because they couldn't really compress those cycle times as much, so you have to kind of build that inventory in. And that was an easy ROI for them. How they missed that, I don't know. The other thing we find is that store replenishment, right? So it's a very important calculation of, okay, when did I run out of a product, or when did I hit my minimum inside of a store to drive a trigger replenishment? And we find that most companies in general take too long to kind of process that. In the distribution center, allocate the inventory, make sure I've got it, assign it to a truck, get it picked, shipped, staged, ready to go, loaded on the truck. They normally sometimes they'll take a couple days to do that. Unfortunately, I mean, that's a long time. I mean, the faster you can compress that, you can drive your cycle times really tight. Inside of distribution centers are faster in a lot of ways because of e-commerce, right? A lot of times you want to get an order at noon, you want to ship it out by 4 or 5. But a lot of the larger replenishments normally still take a lot of time. You can speed this stuff up both through a combination of automation, but you really, if you think about supply chain design, we're taking a look from the source all the way to the customer, design the customer experience, right? And we're taking a look at all the factors that are sort of driving it, which includes cycle times. But you really have to take the same approach to your distribution center design. You have to take a look at the time compression I can create inside of it, and how do I flow that inventory faster, depending on the seasonality or whatever the situation is. So again, an easy way to make money, something that you probably haven't measured, is that cycle time piece. So, get a drink of water here. So if you take a look at some of the key strategies that you have, a lot of things to kind of consider here. One is, in designing a supply chain, you also have to design the inventory flow and the positioning of that inventory and how it's going to get where it's going to go, okay? It's a very important piece to that. If you don't design those two pieces together, you're not going to get the right answer. You would be surprised how many supply chain designs I've seen from the past that other companies have done that were wrong, like bona fide wrong. And the company, like my client executed it in the past, and they found the opposite, right? Instead of saving money, they cost them a lot of money. One of the main reasons is they didn't really take into account the entire operation, how to position inventory, and then if the inventory is out of position, how many transfers would they need to make, right? They just kind of skip that part. So there's no simple way to determine that other than, like I said, get into the weeds, understand how I'm going to position inventory, how do I plan a forecast. If my forecast in my company accuracy is pretty low, it's going to be hard to position an inventory, okay? I have to think through that. I mean, literally I have to think through that. And I've had clients, I had one client that had 40% forecast accuracy. Pretty bad. Hard to design a multi-echelon supply chain for them. We had to design a very specific type of thing. I have had at least one client that had zero correlation between demand and forecast. I won't say their name. Let's just say they're a European telecom company, right? So don't overestimate your forecast accuracy as part of that. But when you design the echelons, you kind of actually simplify it. What you're really trying to do is trying to say, okay, if I don't know exactly where everything goes, and if I have low forecast accuracy in a certain area, how do I centralize? How do I hold that back and protect myself in that inventory, not forward deploy it? And how I design so that, again, seasonality moves, how do I make sure that that works? Another thing that multi-echelon does is it creates shock absorbers for you. Let's say I've got 8 regional DCs, and during the holiday rush, they all get overloaded. Okay, so what do I do about that? What if they're all jammed up? I can't get the product out. Am I going to expand 8 DCs? No, it's crazy expensive. Why don't I just build one DC that holds some of that seasonal import product, and then feed it in as I need it? You see what I mean? Like, you need those shock absorbers. That's part of the echelon. That's why you design it that way. So flexing and demand cycles. So, when you design a supply chain, you're always trying to take a look at my total costs. So some of your costs are fixed, some of your costs are variable. Obviously, transportation is usually a big chunk of that. But when you think about it, you can't design a static environment. You have to design a dynamic environment, which means I have to know how much does it move, right? So for Spirit, they go from almost no sales to lots of sales and then back down again. That's pretty extreme. So almost all their capacity is variable. Almost all their cost is variable. That's how much you need. So how much your supply chain ebbs and flows will tell you how much fixed versus variable capacity you want to have and fixed versus variable cost you want to have. And you want to design that flex into it. What I find is almost every supply chain is reactive in capacity. Oh crap, I'm out of space. Let's get a warehouse across the street and shove stuff in there. Oh crap, I forgot what's over there. By the way, what's the inventory accuracy in that shed across the street? Right? They kind of react until they run out of places to put stuff. If you design that ebb and flow and that flex in there, it really kind of simplifies everybody's world. So from an end-to-end cycle time, everybody's going to tell you design end-to-end, really hard to do, okay? Partly because, the people who are doing the planning, forecasting, buy-in, and sourcing probably have a strategy, right? They may be like, hey, we're going to move some of the product from China to Vietnam. Okay, how much? Well, we're not sure. We're still working on that. Great. Anybody think that affects your supply chain? We just added a week to the inbound cycle time, right? It absolutely affects your supply. I actually had a client, I showed up after they filed. They filed bankruptcy because they did that. They didn't think it was going to cost them anything. Turns out it cost them a bunch of inventory, and then they had a cash flow issue. Like, you got to design that in. So when I say take a look at the end-to-end, first of all, find out what your end-to-end cycle time looks like. Take a look from your time you plan, forecast, buy, and kind of run that through, and then figure out how do I compress different pieces of it. And most of the time, if you're a supply chain executive, you're chasing cost first, then you're chasing service level, and then you're chasing inventory. And you normally don't have time to get to time, right? And when you do a design, you have to look at that as well. So one of the things that's important in a design consideration is how complex do we want to design anything? So my mantra is always design simplicity. Most companies, my company is no different. Most companies, left to their devices, will make things more complex over time. They will always complexify their supply chain. They'll complexify everything, right? I mean, look at how many systems the average medium-sized company runs. So a bunch of systems they barely know how to support. So, if I design a hub store where I'm going to ship from store, we design a warehouse or an import center, if we're designing, a transportation node, how complex do I want to make it? Or do I want to simplify it and make it easy, right? So it's one of the things to kind of keep in mind is when we design these, a lot of times they're trying to say, well, hey, look, let's design just a node, and the only thing they need to do is they're going to cross-dock stuff out to a last-mile shipper, right? And so they can white glove it or whatever it's going to be. And all the complicated pieces around returns and kitting and all that stuff, put that somewhere else, right? Try to keep that complexity out of that supply chain. And here's a big reason why, because things change. And the more complex your supply chain or the more complex your warehouse operations, when things change, they can't adapt. They can't adapt because they'll be fighting fires all day long. Anybody here fight fires in your supply chain? If you're not fighting fires in supply chain, you don't work in supply chain because that's the job, right? The more complex it is, the more fires you got. That's pretty much what I see everywhere I go, okay? So that's one of the things that's important around is simplification. I know there's a lot of debates about importing and how it works. Where do you import from? I often find that supply chain professionals, the supply chain leadership isn't as connected to what's happening with the sourcing and procurement. It's not that they don't talk. It's just that they have different strategies. But where product comes from is very important, okay? And what those shipping schedules look like, what that cycle time looks like, how reliable are those, what's my primary port, what's my backup port, am I building up for Chinese New Year? Like, there's a lot of pieces that go into it. I had a client, a very, very, very well-run company, and they're having lots of issues during peak season where they're running over space. And I said, maybe it's your imports. They're like, no, Nate, it's not imports. Imports are only 7% of our business. So, okay. Turns out it was 30% of the cube of their warehouses during peak. Of course, they had no idea. I was like, look, you got to take a look at what happens imports. Every client that I've seen that moves to private, like private label imports and things like that, their inventory explodes. And they don't factor that in, and then they find out and their warehouse is full, like, oh, what happened? So your import strategy is really tied directly to your supply chain design. I'm not saying start there. Remember, we're going to start with the customer experience. We're going to work our way backward. But if you haven't made it all the way back to your import procurement sourcing strategy, then you're going to miss the boat because they're probably going a different direction. Okay, so you kind of have to put all that together. Okay, so we have hold on, 4 minutes. Okay, who has questions? Not you. Anybody have questions? No questions? You have a question?
My question is, we make material handling devices such as plastic pallets, display pallets, stuff like that. When in the supply chain is returnable solutions considered, and is that something that your customer considers, or is that something that you're consulting or recommending?
You're saying these are material handling that helps returns process? Yeah. So you made a good point. I kind of pushed a lot on the procurement sourcing. I forgot that you got to go all the way through the reverse logistics design, and that's usually at the end. To be honest with you, you kind of go through that design. We do have a number of clients, retail side, publishing, footwear that have very high returns, and we do design that. It's normally the last thing we kind of design layer in. Some companies like to have that more separate from their main supply chain, and some companies design it into their supply chain. I like to use the assets you have. I like to get inventory back as fast as I can. I mean, I used to run a 5-channel retail business, and if I couldn't sell it in the store, I'd sell it online or I'd sell that. So that's a big cycle time thing. How fast can I get something that returned back into the market? And that's kind of a big piece of the design, so that is part of it as well. That's a good question. Anyway, yes, sir.
So what's your view on continuous network design, and what should be the frequency which enterprise should adopt when designing their networks?
That's a great question. Great question. The question was, around continuous network design. Okay, so, and I'm a nerd, right? So I say continuous warehouse design also, continuous transportation routing design. I really do think that when you design, there's 2 layers, I guess, if you take a look at it. What you normally do is you design kind of a roadmap. So think about, I have a customer experience I'm trying to create that's different than I have today as a company. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, based on that, when can I get my systems, my distribution, all that stuff, it takes 3 to 4 years sometimes to build all that out. Design from that, work my way back, figure out what my procurement strategy, sourcing is going to look like, and then design what that supply chain roadmap looks like. And then every year update. Now here's what we run into a lot, and we work with a lot of clients. I mean, the best clients, we work with some of the best companies in the world, and what they do is every quarter they reposition inventory using the same tools that we use to design the supply chain. And so you can either update quarterly or annually, but tweak and adjust. Where am I going to make stuff? Where I'm going to source things? Where do I want to position the inventory? Because it does change quite a bit. And so I'm a big advocate of that. And to be honest with you, you almost kind of want to have a warehouse model that you can also optimize frequently. Okay. I think that's just about all the time we have. We're way over in C. It's only about 40 miles that way. 7279, we got a little circle thing at the top. Come by and visit us anytime. We can talk more. I've got plenty of case studies and examples. Anybody has any questions? And good luck with your supply chain designs.